Welcome everyone to this evening's talk, Why Arthur Erickson Matters, by Vancouver-based architecture critic Trevor Boddy. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Arthur Erickson Foundation and the Government of Canada. We are very grateful for this generous support. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Marco Polo. I'm a professor here in the Department of Architectural Science at TMU. And this event is actually being offered as a guest lecture in a class I am teaching this term on modern and contemporary Canadian architecture, which we have opened to the public. Technically, as this is our normally scheduled time, you're all sitting in on my class. So behave yourselves. My students and I extend a warm welcome. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share a very brief anecdote about Arthur Erickson. In the fall of 2002, I had just started teaching here full-time, and while still editor at Canadian Architect magazine. One of the editor's responsibilities is to organize the magazine's annual awards program, including inviting the jury. We had a policy that any juror could only serve once, so we would review all our past juries to ensure that there wasn't any duplication. I was doing this for the 2002 jury when I realized that Arthur Erickson had never served on any previous Canadian architect jury. So I invited him. He graciously accepted. While he was here in Toronto to sit on the jury, I asked if he would be willing to come to the school to speak to our students. He came over a lunch hour, and right here in the pit, he held court with a full house of enthralled students and faculty, some of whom had worked in Arthur's practice. The atmosphere was electric. It was like the return of the king. It was quite a moment. And that visit remains, at least for me, one of our more memorable events. Now, 22 years later, to this evening's presentation. Trevor Boddy is a critic and curator of contemporary architecture and a Vancouver-based consultant to designers, developers, and governments. His books, articles, exhibitions, and consulting work are dedicated to exploring the relationship between design and contemporary city building. His writing on buildings and cities have been awarded the Alberta Book of the Year and Jack Webster Journalism Prizes, Western Magazine Award, the RAIC Advocacy Award, and an honorary membership in the American Institute of Architects and the Bulgarian Union of Architects. At the 2011 UIA World Congress of Architecture in Tokyo, Boddy's essay on contemporary design in Canada entitled Mega plus Micro, which I believe you delivered here a few years ago, was commended for the UIA Pierre Vago Prize for Best Architectural Criticism published worldwide. His most recent books are City Builder, The Architecture of James K.M. Cheng, Glacier Skywalk, and Stantec Airports. In 2005, he was named Fellow of New York's Institute for Urban Design. Currently teaching at Calgary, he has held academic positions at UBC, where I first met Trevor as a student some 40 years ago, Oregon, Manitoba, Carleton, and Toronto, and he lectures globally on contemporary design. Please welcome Trevor Boddy.
Well, you could tell from Marco's introduction that I'm a bad boy. I'm the only person in the world who's taught at 5 Canadian architecture schools. So I'm an expert at getting fired. So if anyone, I might get fired before the end of this talk. But anyway, good to have you all here. This is a real honor, particular personal honor. I've been building a relationship with Ryerson over the last years, mainly because Marco's here. And that was my entree. But now another, not even a protege, but an ex-student, Lisa Landrum, was my student at Carleton. So I have an unusually deep intercession in this school. I like a lot of what you're doing, and I think you take things like Canadian architecture and city building seriously. So I'm voting with my feet, and I'm here with you tonight. So this is a very special lecture. It's only the second time I've given it. It was given at Waterloo last week. And what I'm trying to do is give you a sense of the importance of Arthur Erickson and his work. Now, this is not a conventional biopic. You know, I'm not going from soup to nuts his whole life, et cetera. That's another talk. This is instead, I'm trying to propose the question of why does he matter? Why should we care? Why should a new generation like the students here tonight care about this guy and his work? Well, tell me after. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. Tell me if there's anything of substance or enduring importance here. But that's the point of it. So it's a kind of rhetorical, why does he matter? I'm here as a critic and a historian to show you a little bit about Arthur. So, oh, there we go. Oh, I want the slide set. Where are we? Oh, there we go. Okay. Here we go. There we are. TMU, that's where we are right now. Okay, this is a shot of Arthur late in life. Um, um, he died in 2009. I'd known him for the last 30 years of his life, et cetera. And here he is, a kind of grand old man. He's suffering from dementia here, having trouble running his office, et cetera, but still a great soul and a kind person. Why does the clicker not work? Do it on here. Okay. So Arthur born in Vancouver, 1924, died in 2009. Last 4 or 5 years were quite difficult, suffering from dementia. And I'm dedicating tonight's lecture to the gentleman in the middle of the picture. That's Joseph Rickworth, the architectural historian and scholar. In 2005, I convened architecture critics from all around the world for a symposium in Vancouver, and the last portion of which was held at the UBC Museum of Anthropology. Arthur was a, excuse me, a huge fan of this idea of a symposium. And Joseph Rickworth himself is trained as an architect. He's not an art historian. He's an architect who writes, and I'm in that mode. So here we are, just rattling through Mexico's leading critic. There's me, there's Joseph Rickworth in the blue shirt, Arthur, Dennis Sharp, my teacher from the Architectural Association in London, the director of the Museum of Anthropology. The guy kind of behind is Roberto Segre, who is a Spaniard who lived in Cuba for many years, et cetera, really good critic. Desmond Hui, who is a graduate of the University of Toronto, teaching at Hong Kong U. Samia Rab from Pakistan, now teaching in the US. And then finally in the far right is Yasmin Sharif from Kenya, now teaching in London. So we were all gathered here with Arthur to talk about contemporary architecture in the city. So this lecture is dedicated to Joseph Rickworth and to other scholars who paved the way. And here's part of our sessions. A wonderful place to have a conference if you can wing it, in the Great Hall of the Museum of Anthropology. So that's the director of the museum and the astonishing surroundings. Okay, so for me, why am I doing this? Why am I here? Well, as a kid in Edmonton, Alberta, we shopped at the local Safeway, and Safeway had a promotion of a kid's encyclopedia in 20 volumes. If you bought a huge amount of groceries, $10 back then, $10 would get you a free paperback edition of the world's history of architecture. This is the one called Caves to Skyscrapers that was bought for me at age 8. And it's a book that changed my life. I'm completely amazed by it. And I got the bug of architecture at a very young age. So the first architect I ever met, and I'll show you how strange I am. At age 14, I'd still never met an architect. And I read in Time magazine that there was an architect from Edmonton who'd done a church in Red Deer. So I tracked him down after school in my parka at -29, went to his office, came in, no one there, one woman in the far corner of the office. And I cleared my throat a few times, et cetera. Finally, I said, is Mr. Cardinal there? And the voice was male, didn't even look up, said, come back in an hour. Well, it's now -32. I go back in the cold. I walk around to stay alive, come back in, and finally that person turned around. It was Douglas Cardinal. And this is in 1969. He turned around, he's wearing a bear claw necklace, hair down his back, etc. Too cool for school. You can be an architect and do that, I'm in. So he's the other person I'm dedicating this talk to, um, because it's part of my history. So let's back up then. I studied at Calgary, very disappointed. After my first year, I was going to pack it in. I had enough of this architecture school stuff. And I went out to Vancouver for the World Habitat Conference. United Nations Environment Program had its first conference in Vancouver. Maurice Strong, who was the head of Petro-Canada and a very wealthy guy, promoted the notion that there'd be an urban conference in Vancouver. So I went there. And this is the Vancouver Art Gallery, for those of you who know it, center of the city. Behind it is Arthur Erickson's Robson Square under construction. So it's back then in the mid-70s when it's just coming up. For the international delegations, the 10,000 people who came from all over the world to talk about cities and architecture, Arthur designed this temporary pavilion in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery. And I think it's really one of his most intriguing work. So I wanted to throw a few things in tonight that you may not have seen. And by the way, there will be also famous buildings by Arthur Erickson that you won't see tonight. I'm not trying to do an encyclopedic coverage. I'm picking and choosing. So these were temporary pavilions in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery, and very prescient for its time. This was a recycled paper pavilion. The entire structure is made out of cardboard sonotubes like we use in construction. That's the columns and the angles. Then there's surfaces built up of newspapers. And they're collected all over BC, and school kids painted them and made these surfaces. So they made this temporary pavilion for Habitat 76. And of course, I was astonished by it. And as an architecture student from Calgary, I'd heard of Erickson, but had never seen anything designed by him, and very, very charmed. So was this guy. Shigeru Ban was at the same conference in 76 that I was at. Shigeru Ban was, again, a fan of Arthur already. Arthur had done a pavilion at the Osaka World's Fair in 70. It super impressed him. When he came to Vancouver, he's there to see Erickson's work. And then he came back for this conference and then took an idea from this and ran with it. So here's Shigeru Ban's temporary housing for hurricane victims from the late 1980s. So in other words, 10 or 15 years after he saw the paper pavilion by Arthur and his staff, he designed this cardboard tube temporary housing for people afflicted by a hurricane. So it's an amazing piece, and I think one of his most important. We've had an offer. This is Arthur Erickson's Evergreen building, I think one of his most underknown but most important buildings, office building in downtown Vancouver from 1976. And then the developer Port Living got a little slender piece of land behind it and wanted to propose matching construction. You see the new wing matches the floor heights, et cetera. And then on top, perched on it, is a kind of bird cage, a mass timber continuation of it. So it's a high-end housing. The only reason Shigeru Ban took the commission was Mr. Erickson. He had this long, slow-burning admiration and said yes to the developer. Sad to say, this project is dead. It got to 2 floors up and was a victim of the pandemic. So there's a partially constructed building here. We don't know what will happen, but I think the gesture and the idea from Shigeru Ban, pretty amazing. So that's a kind of poetic preface. Now we're going to jump into some of the work, and this portion of the talk will be semi-sequential. This is Arthur Erickson with his older brother, Don, on the right. His mother, Myrtle. Isn't that a great prairie name, Myrtle? How many Myrtles do you know, Don Schmidt? Not a one, I bet. Myrtle from Winnipeg. And then the young Arthur Erickson with the 14-year-old ears that all of us males have at that age. His father was a victim of the First World War, lost both of his legs. So in the family, Myrtle was dominant and powerful, intellectual, etc., and made Arthur. And long story short, Arthur learned Japanese in Vancouver. Only 2 universities in North America taught Japanese in 1940, Berkeley and UBC. So he learned Japanese and then joined up with British intelligence because he couldn't get a good gig with the Canadians. And Arthur Erickson spent World War II in India, in hill towns. It was a fabulous war for Arthur because he sat around drinking gin with Oxford and Cambridge dons, talking philosophy, et cetera. And they were waiting for the Japanese invasion of India that never happened. So that was a very important period for Arthur. It was an intellectual time to think and look and to understand Asian architecture. He's never been to Europe, but he goes to India first. And this is very important. Comes back, and he was headed for a career in diplomacy. It was a natural for him. He was a charming guy, could speak several languages, knew some Japanese, natural diplomat. And that was what was going to happen in 1946, 47. And then fate intervened in the form of that noted architectural journal, Fortune magazine, which is really a business magazine. They had a 12-page spread about Frank Lloyd Wright. And that was it. Arthur had the bug. And now it's July. And he wanted to go to architecture school in September. Applied to Manitoba, applied to Toronto. No, they wouldn't have him. Finally, McGill, someone took a risk on him. Because I think it was Norbert Schonauer or one of the refugees on faculty. Said, why not? So this is a 3rd-year architecture school project. And for the students at the back, it's always great to see famous architects' student work. You know, we're all human, and they have strong things and weak things. This is a city hall for Quebec City with the office wing on the left and the council chambers on the right. But I want to point out a few things. Look at how Arthur Erickson, as a 3rd-year student, draws vegetation, draws landscape. He was always deeply, deeply interested in that. He's from Vancouver. He spent a lot of time outside, hiking and climbing, et cetera. So that was evident from the first projects. Then he graduates, and by the early 50s, he's doing this house in West Vancouver, which is an amazingly powerful drawing. Look at how the rocks and the foliage are drawn. There's as much attention to that as there is to the house that he devised behind them. And it's all about the dialogue of a built form with a natural site. And this is a theme that will pop up over and over in Arthur's work. I think he is probably, maybe except for Cornelia Oberlander, he is also the greatest landscape architect that Canada has ever produced. And we'll see evidence of that in a minute. So he couldn't get hired in Canada. We don't hire Canadians. He didn't know what to do with his life. He was getting fired from all the offices in Vancouver. Finally, his friend Doug Chatwell, the director at UBC when Marco was there, told him that University of Oregon would hire him. They like Canadians, and Doug Chatwell had taught there. So Arthur comes, then later, the head of the AA, was a student there, and then me. All the people who can't get hired in Canada, Canadians would go to Oregon and get their first job. When he was in Oregon, he went down to LA and saw this period of Frank Lloyd Wright, the textile block houses, and was overwhelmed by them, and it kind of parked away in his brain as an idea. Originally, like many Wright ideas, this was to be low-cost housing that didn't quite work out that way. This is a very wealthy patron of the arts in Pasadena, Millard House, and it's these cast concrete blocks and with glass in some of them where you have light coming in, et cetera. Very much impressed Arthur, and you'll see in a minute why this comes home to roost later. In this project, just outside of Edmonton, Alberta, this is the lost Arthur Erickson piece. And it was rumored for many years. When I was a grad student at Calgary, I got a big bag of money to write a history of Alberta modernism. It paid triple what I would get from architectural firms. So I wrote a book on Alberta modernism. While researching this, I'd heard about this Arthur Erickson house outside of Edmonton. Nobody could tell me where it was. Most people thought it was a myth. The few people who said it was built said it was long ago demolished. So I didn't know what to do when I was finalizing my text for the book. And I finally talked to Arthur. I said, Arthur, this house you did outside Edmonton, is it still there? Oh no, it's long gone. They were such lovely people. He was an academic, a lawyer, a war hero. She was an art historian. They're a great client, but the house is long gone. Don't waste your time, Trevor, looking for it. So I published Modern Architecture in Alberta, this book, without one of the most important pieces. So there it is. And what you have here, this is only the fourth or fifth house that Arthur had done. It was designed in 1960, 61. It has an amazing site plan, which we don't have time to show you, but it has some other ideas that carry right through Arthur's career. We're going to talk a lot tonight about the flying beam, the beam that projects outside of a building and floats in air. This is something that was invented with this project, then goes on to many of the key houses and the public buildings later. So it was a way to link this house on a rise in a forest outside of Edmonton, to link it with the site. In other words, where the flying beams would direct your vision, would frame your vision, etc. And Arthur, it's an idea that then after this goes through all of his works. Not only did he do the house, but he also designed the landscape around it. There's the house. That pond is artificial. Every tree taken down was taken down by Arthur's direction, etc. It's in the bush, and it's a little hillock, a little rise, looking south, etc. So it's a tiny little demonstration house from the early 1960s. Now, I'm not going to fiddle, and we'll show some more documentation of it later, but I want to keep going since we started late. The next house is this, and one that most of you will know. So the experiments at the Dine House in Edmonton lead to this amazing house in West Vancouver. This is almost certainly the most famous Canadian house or building of the 20th century. It was designed for an artist, Thomas Gordon Smith and his wife, Marion. It's a small house. It's only 1,100 square feet. It wraps around, it's a spiral that wraps around a courtyard, etc., on a magnificent piece of land in West Vancouver overlooking the ocean. And there you have the famous flying beams that start in Edmonton and then continue. In other words, beams that extend past their point of support and float in the air. I asked Arthur about this. He said, well, you know, we could cut off those beam ends. And what would we do with the leftover lumber? Well, we do nothing with it. But actually, structurally, they're kind of useful because they balance the load on the columns. He said, let's just leave them. Let's have them float in the air. And Arthur liked the idea of the blinkers. In other words, the structure would lead your eye out into the landscape from the house. So very, very intriguing idea, and one of his signature notions all the way through his career. I have to also point out the raw rock that sits on. Amazing relationship of built form to a natural site. Intimate integration of wood, concrete, and the natural stone there. This is the house later. You see it's changed color. The owners decided they had enough with having to hand rub oil on their house every 2 years and decided to paint it green. So this is the house after the Smiths repainted it. Arthur hated this. He didn't come for 2 years for drinks because he didn't believe in it. But there they are. There's the couple. That's Thomas Gordon Smith, one of the great abstract painters in Canadian history, and his wife, Marion, who is a superb textile artist in their living room. As you see, the living room is a floating pad over a courtyard and then looking down at the Pacific Ocean. Only a few blocks away is this house, the Graham House by Arthur. Now, this is a few years later, 64, 65. It's a series of volumes that cascade down a very steep slope. There you have it. multiple levels of house, a bigger, more expensive, more ambitious house. But it was difficult to live in, difficult to heat and cool, et cetera. Long and the short of it is that it was demolished 5 years ago by an owner who had had plans for the site, and there's nothing there now. We have very weak heritage legislation in BC, and even a house this important is vulnerable. So Smith House, 1965, 6 by Arthur Erickson. And then I'm happy to bring some good news. I saw this for the first time 5 days ago. I gave this talk at Waterloo, and I connected. It took a long, long time. It took months of negotiation to talk the owner into a visit. This is Arthur's, I think, most important house in central Canada, just outside of Cambridge, Ontario. Very intriguing house because it's a series of masonry planes, walls and masonry, interlaced with wooden glulam structure, et cetera. So in other words, you have the primal tectonic of masonry set in a landscape on a slope, then laced together with wood. So formally, it's a very ambitious house, and it's much bigger. The Smith house we just saw was 1,300 square feet. This one is 6,000. So a more ambitious house. And you see now how the glulam and the other wood elements interlace and are supported by the brick piers. It's it really amazed me. That's the current owner. He's got it for sale. Anyone with 11 million in their pocket, it's yours tomorrow. You'll see a listing for it. And when it's listed, jump at it, go for a tour. Because this house has been unvisitable for a decade. And when it's on the market, it will be visitable. He's an industrialist with a gear and bearing company in Kitchener. But look at that. Okay, parallel planes of masonry with the stitching in between in wood. This is where the pool is. The pool's still there, but the owner is a ballroom dancer and wanted to have 20 and 30 and 40 people over for ballroom dancing. So they built a temporary structure over the pool, but the pool's still there. And he told me it's completely recoverable. So again, one of the amazing tales. There he is again in one of the living rooms, et cetera. Okay, so now on to the major works, the public works, et cetera. By 1963, Arthur Erickson had done about 8 or 10 houses of the scale that I've been showing you, or smaller. Then along comes the opportunity. Our social credit premier in BC, Wacky Bennett, W-A-C Bennett, went for a helicopter ride one day and went by Burnaby Mountain and realized that there's a flat top mountain just outside the boundaries of Vancouver, and said, wouldn't that be a great place for our new university? And just fiat day, he decided that Simon Fraser University would be built on the top of that mountain. That was it. No ifs, ands, or buts, and it had to be done within 2 years. They had an international architectural competition for it. This is the drawing that won it for Arthur Erickson and Jeff Massey. Yes, those Masseys, the Massey family, the Massey medals, et cetera. Central Canadian elite. And Jeff had studied at Harvard, had all the right connections, et cetera, the things that Arthur didn't have from Vancouver. And this is really an astonishing drawing, ink drawing, about yay big, but the detail in it is this kind of bird's eye view of a university conceived as a single building on the top of a mountain, with housing integrated with eating, drinking, et cetera, the academic units, faculty offices, labs, everything, all in one megastructure. And the word megastructure, by the way, had not been invented when this design was proposed. So that's the competition-winning drawing. There's Jeff Massey on the left, Arthur on the right, with their original drawing celebrating their win. Now, do get to Simon Fraser University when you're in Vancouver. It is still a pretty amazing conception. This is the main mall, the central public space of the campus. The main library is on the right, the kind of brutalist concrete building. On the left is the student union and food and beverage and also so on, cascading down the hill. That space frame, there was no space frame available in a catalog anywhere in the world in 1963. So they'd heard of this idea and developed their own space frame with cable and steel struts and wood members. So this is one of the first space frames ever built in Canada over the central square. It rains a lot in Vancouver, as you may have heard, and he wanted to have a civic square that would be rainproof. And this is up the hill a bit. This is the main academic quadrangle with faculty offices ringing around the square space. Arthur knew the Oxbridge model, but didn't want to imitate it directly. And the most radical move here is to lift up the building off the landscape. So on all four sides, you're looking out at the spectacular mountain and ocean vistas from it. So the building disengaged from the landscape to stand free. And it's an amazing, amazing experience. I took Joseph Rickworth up there for the first time, and he was dumbfounded. He really was. He'd seen it published and knew it well intellectually, but had not walked the site, and was and remains till he died 2 weeks ago. A huge fan of Arthur. Now, what was the source of it? Well, it turns out that this is the source, although it was not admitted for nearly 20 years. This is the Mesoamerican city just outside of Oaxaca. And Arthur had looked at the Parthenon and looked at other ancient sites in the Mediterranean as a model for a university, but they weren't big enough. Parthenon didn't work. It was a cluster of buildings. It didn't work for a campus. But he liked the kind of universal extension and axes of Mayan and Aztec architecture. So he'd just seen this, came back, and this becomes the inspiration for a lot of the urban planning and even some of the pavilions there. He wouldn't admit it. He was told that he would lose the commission if the word got out that it was based on a Mexican model. So Arthur didn't like this, and his way of protesting was to put a pyramid in the center of the quadrangle. The box at the top has a Mesoamerican pyramid in landscape contained within it. Even with a pyramid inside it, nobody got it. It was nearly 30 years before anyone wrote that the source of SFU was Monte Alban in Mexico. There's the main axis of the campus. It's been redone, some new pavers, et cetera, be different from what you know, Marco, but it's still a pretty powerful piece of institutional architecture. Around the same time, he gets commissioned to do the office tower for the leading forestry company, Macmillan Bloedel. This is on downtown Georgia Street in Vancouver, still standing, absolute masterpiece. If we had more time, I would show you the original scheme. Original scheme was blockier. And Arthur had remembered from his studies of Greek architecture while traveling as a student that you have entasis, which is a Greek word meaning a kind of correction, a visual correction of built form dealing with perspective. Entasis, you have the tapering of columns, the tapering of buildings, so that they're perceived in a different way. So if you look carefully at the side of Mac Blow, it goes from being 20 feet wide to 6 feet wide at the top. You imagine what, the floors are actually changing. They had to reset the formwork every floor. Imagine what that did to the contractor. Yes, Mr. Erickson, you want to move it 18 inches for the next floor? Is this true? We have to redo all the formwork? Yes. So this is it. But the payoff is it's a very slender, elegant building. It serves one of those little moves to make all the world of difference. The glass line is the same. The glass line is constant, but the building fattens up as it comes down. Mac Blow Tower, 1970 in Vancouver. And you see it's a kind of trabeated frame, concrete frame, rough, et cetera. But I'm happy to report it's now been saved. A pension fund from here in Toronto and some BC people, investors have bought it. And they've renamed it. It's now known as Arthur Erickson Place. So by the 1970s, Arthur is by far and away Canada's most famous and influential architect, to the point of being on the cover of Time magazine, as you see here. And one of my favorite buildings by Arthur Erickson is this building, the University of Lethbridge, Southern Alberta. It was a megastructure. Megastructure was a very powerful idea in the 60s of buildings which would be a city in miniature. You'd have all the functions in one building. You would live in it like a spaceship. And in fact, I'm happy to report that the world phenomenon known as Trekkies, as Star Trek, starts in this building. The students moved into it in the late 60s, and women in particular had sewing skills, and they thought of it as a spaceship, starship. So they made Starship Enterprise outfits. And I remember going there. I was a student in Edmonton at the time, came down, and all the kids were wearing Star Trek outfits. So this is it. Arthur's megastructure, et cetera. You see it's in a coulee, it's got a gap in the middle. There was going to be 2 other parallel buildings. There'd be a whole complex there, never built. And I hate to say it, it's absolutely embarrassing to see what's been built uphill from it. And then this is a book I worked on with interviews with Arthur talking about the building. I hope you have it in the library. If you don't, we'll get you one. Now this is the end. You see, that's a knockout panel. It was always intended that the building would continue to be something on this side. So they have a temporary wooden elevation there, knockout panel for the building that was to extend. Never happened. And I hate to tell you this, but look at this. That's what got built. Hello, KBMB of Toronto. Hello, Mitch. This is a very, very embarrassing addition to Arthur Erickson's masterpiece. Jammed up next to it, higher than the original building, completely different palette. It was as if the Erickson building did not exist. And I think we have to start calling out crimes. Mitch Hall of Toronto, Ontario, project architect. We have to call out when these things get done, because they are crimes. So a few years later, by the early 70s, 72, 73, Arthur gets his dream commission, partly from Pierre Trudeau, who was his friend, traveling companion, et cetera. Got the commission from the federal government to do a museum of anthropology at UBC. Nothing like it had been done in Canada, a museum dedicated to First Nations, and a brilliant site overlooking the Pacific Ocean, set at the edge of the UBC campus. And this is Arthur presenting the maquette for the original proposition. Very lush landscape, but that's what we have in BC. And you see it's a series of portal frames. These are abstractions of Haida and Kwakiutl houses from up the coast. In other words, he takes the historic precedent from First Nations, doesn't imitate it, but reduces it to an argument and amplifies it in scale. And I think that's how smart architects use history. You don't directly cop the detail, you try to understand it, and you adapt it to size and function. So the portal frames with the cantilevered overhangs are part of West Coast traditional architecture. This is before it got cleaned up. And this is one of my favorite images that I used to promote this talk, et cetera. There is Arthur looking at the maquette in 1962 of his creation. Now, Arthur got fired by most of the big offices in Vancouver for being too dreamy. He'd be sitting there rolling his eyes and thinking. The last thing you want in a Canadian architectural office is thinking, you know, it gets in the way of production. So he got fired repeatedly. He got fired twice from Thompson Burke, Pratt, et cetera. And then ended up going off traveling, teaching, et cetera. So here's Arthur looking at his creation. And here's what it inspired. This is a Hollywood movie called Intersection, based on a French film of the same name, about a visionary architect and his wife. So Richard Gere as the proto Arthur Erickson, and his wife, who's a partner in the business. And that's the model of the UBC Anthropology Museum. This was made by Nick Melkovich, the very architect who worked with Arthur on the first model you just saw. He did it for the film producers. They had to pull it apart to get the camera in and so on. So anyway, Richard Gere plays a very, very Arthur Erickson-like architect. Why? Well, the production crew came up from Hollywood, and there was a connection to a woman whose father was a contractor, Habler. And she knew architecture, and she met Arthur through family connections. And she said, well, production designer, production team, let's go meet a good architect, Erickson. So they met him, they hit it off, then they toured a few things, and then they could see a potential here. So they brought back Richard Gere and the director, and they toured Arthur's houses for days on end and completely fell in love with it. Richard Gere is a Buddhist, so he really got along with the kind of new age cosmic quality of Arthur, and they became friends. In fact, Arthur designed a house for Richard Gere, never built in LA, whatever. So here you have it. You can get it on, it's not on Netflix, but it's on one of the services now. For $5, you can watch it. Not a great movie, but it's hilarious because they shoot the whole movie in Erickson Building, in houses, public buildings, et cetera. It's a kind of a meta, very postmodern, 1992, a commentary on Arthur and his work. So in honor of this, for Arthur's 100th birthday, I curated 3 evenings of talks and screenings of films, et cetera, both nonfiction documentaries and Hollywood features that used Arthur's work. Twist my arm, sometime we could mount a version of it here. By the mid-70s, he's doing some of his biggest and most impressive works. This is Robson Square in downtown Vancouver, the former provincial law courts in the foreground, and then a series of parks, undulating parks, et cetera. It was thought that you could not have any flat space. Arthur's design direction was that there should be no place for more than 30 people to gather at one time. Why? Because they were worried about strikes and protests and people being there. So he was given direction to make an undulating landscape where you could not have a mob in one spot. So Robson Square is the result. And he assembles an amazing team. Bing Tom was his project leader. James Cheng, just out of University of Washington, becomes the hot-powered detailer of many of the buildings. And so on, Eva Masasaki, an astonishing team of talented people. It's also mid-70s, there's a recession everywhere else. Everyone's flocking to Alberta and BC to work. So that's Robson Square. Some of the public spaces, the law courts, the cascading of the concrete trabeated frame. It's amazing, when they built that, you could not get a space frame out of a catalog. Those are all custom members. They had to engineer and manufacture it themselves. In 1974, you cannot get a space frame, and Arthur was ahead of the curve and premised the building on it. And again, it's a megastructure. It's a rich compaction of programs. It's a senior provincial courthouse for BC, and it's got basically a convention center, now a UBC facility below, parking, all integrated in one thing. And then the really astonishing landscape. Now, Cornelia Oberlander implemented Arthur's vision, but she did not design it. It's very, very clear from the documents now that Arthur was the landscape architect of Robson Square, and Cornelia implemented it brilliantly. So you have amazing things. You see the mound of planting on the right side, huge blocks of styrofoam underneath this, because when they devised the structure for the parking thing below, there wasn't enough support for a lot of concrete there. So blocks of styrofoam on top of which is soil and plants, whatever. So next time you're in Vancouver, remember, you're standing on styrofoam. I think it's a good slogan for BC. We stand on styrofoam. Welcome to British Columbia. This is one of my teachers, Rainer Banham, the British architectural historian and critic. wrote an amazing book on megastructure, which was a fad or a phase in the 60s and 70s. And he has a huge ratio of Canadian work in it, about a quarter of all the buildings in it. Canada was deeply into megastructure. We wanted integrated buildings like Hub Mall in Edmonton, et cetera, that put people together in an indoor space who could live together. In other words, we could have public spaces, urban spaces in Canada. So a very influential book. Way before that, though, this is an amazing drawing by Arthur. 1956, as best we can date it. Arthur and Jeff Massey had been hired by the Community Arts Council of Vancouver, which is a kind of docent, public good organization, to do a study of downtown. They did it, a kind of earnest planning thing. And then off the side of it, Arthur went off on the Burrard Street Bridge, looked west, and imagined there would be a new bridge built further west that would link West Vancouver to the west end of Vancouver proper. What you see on the right is the west end, now the high-rise zone of downtown Vancouver. On the left is the point there, and this is all his propositions. These organic, swooping, 50 and 60-story high buildings. Now it is amazingly ahead of its time. Don't forget, 1950s. This kind of organic expression, visionary expression. If you look at the Japanese metabolists, etc., Arthur is absolutely with them or even in advance of them. However, we don't have an intellectual infrastructure in Canada, and nobody was writing about that. So Plan 56, this is another megastructure, in this case in Montreal, Arcop's Place Bonaventure. It's a rail station, a transit station, a shopping mall, a convention center, a hotel, offices, etc., all in one building. So megastructure was on everyone's lips at the time, and particularly here in Canada. And then at the same time, metabolism is growing in Japan, et cetera, visionary projects, most of them unbuilt. Oh, sorry. So this is an exhibition I put together for London, for Trafalgar Square, for the Canada House, which also showed in Paris and then came to Vancouver for the Olympics. The name of the show was Vancouverism, Architecture Builds the City, and it was a collection of our best creations in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. That is the original drawing, or a reproduction of it at right scale. It was a small drawing at the place of honor at the start of the show. And this is in the atrium of West Bank's Woodward's project. So we got a free indoor space, and we had artifacts, objects from buildings there to animate the show. And I just want to, well, here's the drawing marked up. You see, it was made into a PMT and then put in Arthur's first book and then lost. This drawing was lost for 40 years. Arthur would tell me about it. He says, Trevor, it's all in that drawing. Vancouverism is in that drawing. It's all there, but we can't find the drawing. Where did it go? And poor Arthur was then getting dementia, couldn't quite figure out. The University of Calgary in their archives found it, stuck to the side of a box, and they pulled it off, restored it. And my show was the first time it was shown in public. Now, I want to point out something. Well, it's too bad that you marked up the drawings there. It's too bad. He says, Trevor, that's not a mistake. That's the green roof. I said, Arthur, in 1955, there was no green roofs in Germany or Denmark, never mind Vancouver. Well, that's because we're Vancouver, way, way ahead of the game. And the smudge turns out to be the trees growing on the shared podium, out of which spring these massive residential towers, each with a deck, looking southwest to the Pacific Ocean. Amazing project ahead of its time. So an idea I adapted from Arthur called the constructed landscape. You have natural landscape, then we make landscapes from buildings. I think it's the most important operative idea in Canadian architecture. It's the name of the book of my collected writings that I'm working on now. The constructed landscape, writings on Canadian architecture since Expo 67. And here's a great shot of Arthur standing on debris. And one of my favorite projects of his, the Evergreen Building on the right. This was published in a book in England about 20 years ago. This is the Evergreen Building. So when you come to Vancouver, I'm showing you some things you might not see otherwise. Go look for the Evergreen Building just west of downtown. The developer had bought the site. It was not sure if you wanted offices or residential. It was kind of iffy, and he thought he could make more money with offices. And the instructions to Ericsson's team was to make the building adaptable from housing into offices and vice versa. So on the ocean side, facing the north towards the Pacific Ocean, you have these serrated decks, very large decks with beautiful planters ringing them. But this time, Cornelia Oberlander's working with him and designs all the landscape, made it work there for the Evergreen Building. The other side, I don't have a shot with this show, but it's a clean and sober office building. And imagine the difficulty of going from this organic terraced conception on one side, turning the corner and becoming a conventional downtown office building. It's a tour de force of detail. And I use it with my students all the time in explaining how you turn corners and how you adapt to two different urban conditions. So there you have Cornelia's hanging ivy off the planters, et cetera. We're very happy. We're astonished we saved this. It was threatened for 15, 20 years. And it took IBI, of all people, a big corporate firm based here in Toronto. And they had a guy called David Tom, who was their head in Vancouver. And he got a very tough lease for 30 years and was unwilling to break it. And the owner came and offered him a pile of money, said, no, we're not breaking it, we're staying here. And they sicked a lot of big Bay Street lawyers on the developer, and they fought for 8 or 9 years, spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees. Finally, they relented, and then the building got designated, it's been restored, et cetera. So it's a rare heritage good moment in Vancouver. Now, we're moving into Strangeau land. Here is Bjarke Ingels, the Danish superstar architect who does your King Street project now rising here in Toronto, which followed this project in Vancouver, and the developer Westbank, who did both, Ian Gillespie. So I'd say half of my income in the last 2 or 3 decades is from Westbank, from his company. This is the model of it. I think most of you will know it if you've been to Vancouver, the cantilevered tower leaning out over the Burrard Street Bridge with the low wings of offices and restaurants at its base. This is an amazing photo. This is a photo actually taken by James Cheng, who didn't just wanted to help out, and he's a really good architectural photographer, so he got it right. This is the rendering of it. Burrard Street Bridge there, sorry, the Granville Bridge in the foreground, Burrard Street Bridge over there, and looking out west. And then Arthur again, now in Washington, in Washington, D.C. This is one of Arthur's most controversial projects. It was, a lot of people didn't like it, especially here in Toronto. In the 1980s and 90s, Toronto was the capital of neo-modernism, a very tight, very conservative, modern ethic. It's a complex story, but it has to do with fights between George Baird and Peter Pragnell in the period. The modernists won, and Toronto is a very severe modernoid town. So when Arthur came to build in Washington, it's basically mandatory postmodernism. There are design regulations requiring you to have classical details, columns, et cetera, references. So Arthur, I think, dealt with these rules quite brilliantly, turned them on the head. There's a great sense of Canadian irony. Northrop Frye says the basic mode of Canadian thought is irony. So he ironically uses the rules as given to make this embassy. It's the one and only embassy that will ever be built on Pennsylvania Avenue. So to the left is the White House, and to the right is the Capitol. So we got a special site in the heart of Washington for this. I don't have time to explain it to you in detail, but look up, I had, back in the glory days, I had 20 pages with 30 images to write a critique of it in Canadian Architect. And this is the cover story from whatever it is, 1990. Arthur's sketch, now it's unusual, it doesn't fill the site. In fact, they didn't have enough building to fill the site. So they pushed the building to the perimeter and opened up a courtyard in the middle. And then there's a classic temple on Pennsylvania Avenue, et cetera, a row of columns, et cetera. So they had the luxury of not having to build to the line. Now, those are Doric columns without capitals. So in other words, Arthur is playing with the classical rules. You never have those columns without a capital. And they're made of aluminum, by the way, et cetera. And this is the kind of drop-off zone where the ambassadors would arrive to come meet our political people there. It's an amazing landscape. It is a kind of constructed landscape. And here's the front door. And Cornelia, as landscape architect, devises the hanging ivy drooping down over the building. And nearly done here. We'll just do a few more projects. I'm not going to show you Arthur's very last works. He was not really on top of the game by then, being exploited by developers and lesser firms. But in my view, this is the last great Arthur Erickson building in downtown, near downtown Vancouver, right near Granville Market, if you know that. This is the waterfall building, and there's the skyline and the structure. Oh, sorry. No. So Arthur had done some high rises now, and he wanted to investigate how you could get similar density in a maximum 7-story building. So the challenge here was to have a series of tight courtyards with a housing all around it, roof decks up top. Beautiful idea of having the spiral stair from the living room up to your own roof deck. It's a fantastic detail. You know, stairs take up a lot of interior space, and the idea is to push it to the perimeter. And then there's the courtyard here. There's Arthur late in life with Win Beleska, who was an architect working for him at the time. There's a section, very, very interesting section. This was to be a restaurant. Open space, never worked as a restaurant. The concept was that the water would flow, go over the glass, and you'd have shimmering water on glass, even on a sunny day. Arthur was a great advocate of rain and grayness. And it said that Vancouver, you have to deal with this. And in fact, I'm going to give you rain 365 days a year by having water running over the windows of this restaurant. Never worked, leaked like a fish. Every restaurant in there is failed. You can rent it tomorrow for your budget. Now, here it is. The owner of the building was a guy called Stephen Hines, a wealthy kid, PhD in philosophy, 32 years old, wanted to do something special. And he got into the server farm business. And the basement of this building was designed as a server farm. Endless CPUs running 24 hours a day. Whenever you're using Hotmail or Yahoo, whatever, it would go through here. So the problem with server farms is they generate huge amounts of heat. The whole idea of the waterfall in the waterfall building was the water was used to scrub the heat out of the server farm, would come outside, lose its heat, and go back again. So technically, and a bodacious kind of idea. Look up at the section. That's the slip section from Unité d'Habitation of Corbusier. The interlocking, the 2-story on one side, 2-story on the other, interlocking with a corridor on every second floor. The first time it had been built in North America. An amazing thing. Arthur had wanted to do it ever since he saw it as a student in the early 50s. Here is the restaurant wedge shape being constructed. And there it is, early occupation. Quite narrow, but quite tight. I think it's a magnificent space. I wish I'd bought a unit there. They were amazingly underpriced when they went on the market. And of course, now people know what it is. And then, as you saw earlier, the spiral stair up to your own private deck overlooking downtown. Spectacular piece of living. Okay, last few images to talk about Arthur's legacy, about his influence on Canadian architectural culture. It might not be apparent at first, but Douglas Cardinal is a huge student and protege of Arthur Erickson. Douglas studied at UBC when Arthur was just starting teaching part-time. And in the end, they threw Douglas out for quote unquote having the wrong family background to be an architect. So he got booted back to Alberta and went around, finally got an architecture degree from Texas. No Canadian school would take him. He applied to Toronto, McGill. He'd been blanched out of the Canadian system. So he got his degree from the University of Texas, came back and did a couple cabins and small houses, and then met up with a visionary kind of Austrian priest, Father Merckx, and got the commission for this St. Mary's Church in Red Deer. So there's the plan, the very tight plan. All the liturgical functions are dealt with in that plan, done with a double wall of brick, et cetera. Doug's early masterpiece. And it's the building that led me into architecture. I knew of it and went to see it. This is a little bit later. This is Douglas Cardinal's Grand Prairie Community College. No, excuse me. This is one of my favorite images of all Canadian architecture, because you have a landscape here being transforming into architecture. You can almost feel the sloughs and the ponds and the poplar bluffs around here turning into buildings. And this raw state of early construction where the first walls are being formed on the site. You can see Doug Cardinal's organic language, et cetera. But Doug was and remains a huge fan of Arthur's, and Arthur became a prototype to him of what the architects could do in places like Western Canada and in a place like Grand Prairie for a community college. And this is the book that Doug and I produced in the late 80s about his work and organic ethos. Arthur was interested in organic forms, but not as much as Cardinal. But again, people don't understand it. This is the idea that I'm promoting called the constructed landscape. We have the natural landscape, and then we build a landscape with buildings and streets, et cetera. And I think the constructed landscape is a very powerful idea in Canadian architecture. My book will argue that it's the central idea, that our most interesting designers are dealing one way or another with the notion of the constructed landscape. So this is the Canadian Museum of History, formerly of Civilization in Hull, right across from the Parliament buildings. Another brilliant Canadian architect, Clifford Weeds, another huge fan of Arthur. And Arthur's example and mentorship opened up doors for people like Clifford Weeds. This is the heating and cooling plant at the University of Regina from the late 60s. It's all full of mechanical boilers, et cetera, heating the whole campus. But it's a simple little Doric masterpiece. There's the end elevation of it. The glass panels are slip glass. You can pull them out. You got to get a new boiler in the building. You can remove that elevation, take the big pieces of equipment out, put them back in. Clifford Weeds was a farmer, Mennonite farmer from Saskatchewan. He had that kind of making do ethos that farmers have. They have to survive. This is the exhibition that I did on Clifford Weeds' work. Closest it got here was at Cambridge at Waterloo. This is an amazing little project by Clifford Weeds. It's a campground. This is the shared restrooms and cooking shelter for a campground on the Trans-Canada Highway, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. Really an amazing primal piece of construction that is dealing with the landscape and in dialogue with it. Finally, and to bring things closer to home, if you talk to Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, the influence or the model or the ideas of Arthur Erickson are front and center. they are fully acknowledging Arthur's inspiration to them. And I think in many ways, they carry on many of the ideas that were kind of buried or implicit in Erickson's work, and now they are at the core of theirs. This is a little pavilion in a ravine here in Toronto. It is not occupied. There's no bedroom. It's a little shelter to have a drink with strangers, etc. Beautiful piece of work. But the whole idea of the geometry of the building through site works extending out into the ravines, etc. There. And they credit Erickson, Smith House, other things. Bridget worked for Arthur for a while, no, or Howard did too, maybe. But anyway, this is Shim and Sutcliffe carrying on many of the ideas developed by Arthur Erickson here in Canada. So in this talk, I've tried to make an argument. I've tried to explain to you why I think Erickson is an important architect 100 years after his birth, and how many of his ideas have great import and great possibilities today. I thank you very much for coming tonight. I'll get the mic going.
Okay.
I need these back. This is my first book. This is a monograph. And then two other things. Calgary architect Jeremy Sturgis does really interesting work with landscape and then finally, this catalog of so I do need those back here. So bring them back.
Okay, thank you very much, Trevor. We do have time for questions. I do ask that if anyone has questions for Trevor, please use this microphone. I will be passing it around because we are live streaming and recording. If you simply ask your question, no one will hear outside of this room. So if you have a question, please let me know and I will get the mic to you.
Well, it gets at the back.
Hello, Trevor. I'm in Marco's class, and a lot of our, there you go. And we're having a lot of discussions on like what is Canadian architecture. And so a question I had for you was whether you see Arthur's architecture as being more regional, like Vancouver or BC, or do you see it also alluding to a kind of a national type of architecture for Canada?
You do the best you can.
Trev.
But his Bank of Canada.
Please use the mic so that
okay,
I can hear. Yeah.
The Bank of Canada building opposite the Parliament buildings in Ottawa is a pretty amazing building, and it deals with its context and Parliament Hill and the kind of vestigial Gothic revival up there. But it is an amazing building. So Arthur could work in the center of the city like Ottawa and do it in an amazing way. The interior courtyards, et cetera, are amazing. Deferential to the old Bank of Canada from the 30s around it. It's a very fine piece. Then on the other end of the rainbow, you have here in Toronto, Roy Thomson Hall, which I didn't show because you all know it. That's a hybrid. A lot of that building is Bing Tom. Bing Tom did the container, the ovoid outside portion of the building. Arthur did the tiers of seats inside. Arthur wasn't quite convinced of a kind of ovoid form, the outside, and Bing solved that and then did it inside. To answer your question, I do think that kind of self-conscious tilting after the windmills of Canadian architecture is not particularly useful. What is useful is doing very, very good work, which deals with landscape, urban situation, and program, all the basics of architecture. And that's what Arthur did. And he kind of reinvented Canadian architecture by virtue of doing that at different scales in different places all around the world. I didn't show you any of his Middle Eastern work. Much of it never got constructed, but it is pretty audacious. But I think the best buildings got built here in Canada. And Ericsson's ability to pick up from doing a mega structure like University of Lethbridge to the finer grain of the houses, to the Chancery in Washington, is really tribute to his flexibility. So I guess I think those kind of belly button debates about, oh, Canada, whither Canada, what is our architecture? You know, those are not particularly useful, and Arthur had no time for it. He was too busy building or jetting off with Francisco, his boyfriend and partner, to LA, et cetera. So there's other fish to fry in the world. And Arthur didn't, whenever a journalist would start on a question about, could you define Canadian architecture for us? He says, well, we all define Canadian architecture every day when we get up and live in the city. So that is the ongoing definition of it, which I thought was a really good answer. By the way, in World War II, Arthur went from the hill towns of India to ending up in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. He spent nearly a year there as the head of Radio Malaya. He was the head of the national broadcasting system of Malaya, and he was on air. And Arthur developed this wonderful radio voice. He has a very mellifluous voice, and he did that by literally reading the news, et cetera. So he had an amazing set of skills and qualities and some weaknesses, financial, double bankruptcy. And I think for too long in Canada, we've only talked about those tragedies, not one, but a double bankruptcy. Lots of people owed money across the country. But in the end, we have to go back and look at the ideas. I think with the centennial of his birth, 100 years this year, and that's why I'm here tonight, there's now an opportunity to reassess him. Yes, acknowledging that there was shoddy financial management, but in the end, also some amazingly creative work. So good question. I hope I answered that. Next. Next. Oh, Lisa, you have those strong lungs for all that swimming. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Brilliant lecture. Thank you very much, Trevor. Arthur Erickson and Douglas Cardinal. Of course, those two brilliant architects are brought together through your scholarship and friendship with them. Did they have any collaborative experiences together? And I guess more broadly, I'm wondering about Arthur Erickson's relationship to Indigenous architecture. I mean, certainly his statements related to Simon Fraser that architecture should be of the land and not on the land certainly speaks to a land-based architecture that we might appreciate today. But I'm wondering, what do you know about his relationship with Indigenous architecture?
Oh, you're recording. They knew each other. Again, Cardinal was literally thrown out of UBC. He won the top prize in first year studio, and by Christmas they put him in the studio of a rigid Bauhaus Orthodox modernist. And this Doug was already interested in organic form, and they tried to break him down, make him a new person, and it didn't work, and he got thrown out of school. So, but that made Doug tougher and did all that he did. Doug did do some straight modernist buildings, and in my book, they're collected there. But very quickly, by Simon Fraser time and the 60s, et cetera, Doug was then studying at University of Texas in Austin. but knew that there was a real talent there in Canada. And people asked about what work was happening in Canada. It was Erickson that he talked about. Then they came back to Canada, and bit by bit, they got to know each other a bit. They're not great friends, but they admired each other from a distance. Arthur thought that Doug was really onto something and helped promote him to get the museum in Ottawa. Very complex shuffle happened there. People had applied for the other building. Do moved around. We had a prime minister then who cared about architecture, maybe too much. And it was a great friend of Arthur, et cetera. So the National Gallery by Safdie and the Cardinal's Museum of Civilization, now the Museum of Man, were the product of that. They respected each. What links them, the two of them, Cardinal and Erickson? Both were deeply, deeply interested in landscape. And the dialogue of built form with landscape. And if there's a theme that emerges in both of their work, it is that. And that's one of the fundamental themes of my own writing and my own book will be, how do we as Canadians find forms that work with this land, this landscape, the rocks, the trees, the horizon, et cetera. So they had an admiration going. I got to have dinners with the two of them a few times, and they're like old brothers come together. So it was very sweet. But they are two really signal presences. The nice thing about both of them is they both dealt well with cities. In other words, they thought of urban landscapes as a continuation of the natural ones. In other words, the same regimen you use to look at a rural landscape or by the Ottawa River at the museum, you applied the same analysis to a streetscape or a corner. And if you think about Arthur Erickson's Evergreen with its urban facade on one side and the organic ocean-facing facets on the other, you get the notion that here is an architectural talent that really takes site seriously. And if you look at Doug Cardinal's buildings, same thing. They are rigorous in their reinterpretation of site and natural landscape. So good question. Yeah. Another one. Don.
Thanks, Trevor. I agree with the comment. Brilliant lecture. Fantastic. Thank you so much for finding some of those kind of fresh drawings. The kind of house in Cambridge, Ontario. There were some real revelations in the lecture tonight. So thank you for that. The question I have is about, and it's kind of further to Lisa's comment about indigeneity and his interest in that. And obviously the Museum of Anthropology, 1972, roughly.
72, 76. Yeah.
You know, is a kind of powerful representation of a kind of deep understanding of that relationship between landscape and the kind of founding peoples of that community. One of the things that I've never quite been clear about in the museum, it's an astonishing piece of architecture, but it also combines with a really kind of fresh new way of exhibiting materials, the accessible collection space, the way the kind of artifacts are displayed. There is a kind of a kind of symbiosis, a kind of relationship between objects exhibited and the architecture, which is incredibly rare and incredibly special about that building. What was the working relationship? Do you know about the working relationship between Erickson as the architect and the curators, or the curatorial kind of basis of the museum? Because it seems one of the most powerful integrations I've ever run into.
You know, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French philosopher, was a regular visitor to the Northwest Coast in the 60s and 70s. And Ames, the director of the Museum of Anthropology, knew Lévi-Strauss really well. Lévi-Strauss kept saying, you Canadians, excuse me, you have some of the most amazing landscapes and buildings in the world. Why don't you celebrate? So Lévi-Strauss was shaming the faculty of anthropology at UBC to take it seriously, and shamed Arthur when he met him, etc. So there's a kind of agenda announced that how can we have architecture that rises to the historic tradition of the Haida and Kwakiutl traditional buildings, while at the same time also rises to the power of the landscapes around them. Not an easy task, to solve both of those equations simultaneously. Arthur had, by this time, early 70s, collected one of the most astonishing staffs going. It was recession in the US and in Eastern Canada, so he got huge input of talent who wanted to come work with him based on Lethbridge and the earlier works. So he had huge talent to solve all the problems. A little detail, when you're at the Museum of Anthropology next time, go look at the collection system. It's an open collection system, visible storage, revolutionary idea. And most of the museum people said, no way, we can't do it. We're risking things. No, it's now standard worldwide and developed there. So Arthur working with his curatorial but they made it happen in space and time and budget. So a few museums had done it, but it really is done at a large scale there. And you could go open drawers, see arrowheads, see fabrics, etc. And then wonderful thing is it dematerializes the imposition of the museum. In other words, it opens up to new things. The notion of abstracting the Haida and Kwakiutl house frames, the portal frame comes from traditional First Nations architecture. Arthur had no interest in building it at scale or building a simulation of it. So as good architects do, he reduced it to an argument. What is the essence of these houses and with the post and beam and the cantilever, very important. They exist in all of the First Nations houses in BC for structural reasons. They help balance things, etc. They're there. So he got to know that and had good advisors, etc. But most importantly, Arthur had grown up in BC and spent a lot of time, had gone up to Haida Gwaii, had seen the houses, which are mainly ruins at that time. And he liked the company of intellectuals, academics, etc. So really knew a lot about it. So the idea is you take something and you reduce it to an argument. What is the essence of the Haida or Kwakiutl longhouse? How could it be transposed 20 times bigger, higher, and done in concrete? So I think that lesson is a really astonishing lesson. It's a difficult one. I know when I've tried to teach it in different architecture schools and studios, it's one thing to tell students to draw upon those sources, another thing to realize it. So very, very, very unusual. The building, by the way, as you probably may or may not know, was completely rebuilt. The Great Hall is a complete reconstruction in the last 4 years, $40 million worth. There were some structural problems with the cross braces. Water was getting in, the steel was rotting away, and it was in possible danger of collapse. And very unlike Canada, federal government, the province, and the university came up with 40 million, and quietly during the pandemic said, let's do this. That doesn't happen very often in Canada. Good question. Okay, another couple more.
Anyone else?
Well, thank you, Trevor, for a really wonderful talk. I think the way that you sort of historicized Erickson's work is really compelling. And I keep getting stuck on the fact that he's sort of right there with the Japanese metabolists and maybe even a little bit ahead of them. But I wonder if we sort of tried to plot Arthur on sort of Charles Jenks blobs of influence. Who are the thinkers, whether architectural or philosophical or literary, that we would see as some of his influences? And since you knew him, were there architects? I mean, you mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright as a childhood influence, but were there architects that he really saw as his own predecessors and influences?
Well, the primal interests were the things he saw in World War II in India. He went to Fatehpur Sikri, many temples all through India, right, Pagan in Burma. So he saw monumental Asian architecture. Read about Japanese, didn't get back till 1960. And that's a crucial date because that's just before he designed the Dyed House in Edmonton. So he was thinking about Japanese architecture, just come back, Canada Council, 3 months in Japan and done it. So you have those vernacular sources. The long admiration for Wright as persona, as larger than life, as a public intellectual, et cetera, hugely important. But we shouldn't discount also what he saw in Europe. He got the Pilkington Glass Traveling Scholarship at McGill, which normally people would go have a great party for 2 months, drink a lot, eat some good French meals, and come back, and then become a hack at a big corporate firm. Arthur did not do that. He took the wrong ship, ended up going all the way to Alexandria. He arrived in Europe for the first time in Alexandria, Egypt, worked his way around the Mediterranean basin from that side. So he was exposed to a whole different range of European architecture. He did all the hits, Corbu, Mies, et cetera, in the last month of a 2-year trip. You know, he ran around and had to go see the monuments. So you take, Mediterranean classicism, Japanese tradition, megastructure, et cetera, all those influences. Arthur was dreamy. He got fired by Thomson Burke Pratt not once, but 3 times, always for sitting there staring into the air. And they thought he wasn't working. You know, the notion that if you're thinking you're not working, he got that a lot. But they then rehired him, brought him back, et cetera. But he was not a great employee. Some of us are not great employees. My friend is a good employee. I'm not one myself. It's a complex question. I do think growing up in Vancouver, intellectually ambitious mother, a docent at the Vancouver Art Gallery, Arthur had a one-man show of his paintings at age 17 at the Vancouver Art Gallery. So he had precocious graphic talent and a mother who pushed him into things. So that was very, very important early experience. And he had kind of no fear, a bit like me. Growing up in Edmonton, no one told me I couldn't be a critic or an architect, whatever. There's no one breathing down your neck saying, who the hell are you to write about Doug Cardinal, whatever. So I do think that was enormously important for him. And it was also how he was able to take influences and ideas from Asia, combine them with the ancient Mediterranean world, together with leading edge modernism, to be able to pick and choose between those. And I think that is the source of a lot of his brilliance. Yeah. Sure, a couple more questions.
Just before I pass it on to someone else, just a little coda to that. You
Yep.
talked about him having an exhibition and being a painter. Didn't he take lessons from Lauren Harris? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, he was a family friend. A lot of the group of 7 had moved out to the West Coast when things kind of fell apart in Toronto. They moved out west. So Lauren Harris was inspirational, but he knew them all, met them all at various times. But he decided he tried to take up more painting, but didn't have the talent he thought. And like I say, he was going to be a diplomat. He was learning languages. He was graceful with people, well-dressed, had all the apparatus of a diplomat, but then got the architecture bug and did it. Again, I'm so grateful to him. I mean, I didn't tell you the whole story, but right back to the beginning of the lecture, the habitat structure in Vancouver in front of the art gallery. Well, I had just finished first-year architecture school in Calgary and was going to pack it in. I was hugely disappointed, uninspirational. I was quitting, and my last act was to go to Habitat. And well, Buckminster Fuller gave a talk, and Paula Soleri and Margaret Mead and da-da-da. So I got really excited again, and I heard Arthur speak then. And I go right back. There we go. So I heard him speak, and I'm very impressed. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Erickson, I'm a student at Calgary. Will you come speak to us?" He says, "Oh, sure, please. I'd be happy to. I'm doing it at a university in Lethbridge, and I'm there all the time." So I go back to Calgary. I was a student on the lecture committee with the downtown guys, and said, "Let's bring Arthur Erickson in." They said, "Sure, if you can get him, do it." So I phoned up his secretary, Merle, in Vancouver. And I said, "We'd like to have Erickson give a talk in Vancouver." "I'm sorry, but Mr. Erickson will only give lectures to chambers of commerce and bankers or organizations. Click. That was it. He was no longer doing universities or art galleries, whatever. He was starting to go broke, and he wanted to have people with money and deep pockets. I didn't know how to take no for an answer. So I went down to the Chamber of Commerce and said, "Do you want Arthur Erickson as a lunch speaker?" "Yes," in a moment. And we organized it, whatever. I had to work the door. Mira Goddard, the gallerist from Toronto, showed up, had no money. So I had to pull $20, my whole spending money for the week, to pay for Mira Goddard to go into the lunch, and never got paid back, by the way. Anyway, so this starts my dialogue with Arthur as a student, and then out in Vancouver and so on. So we had a Socratic dialogue for a long time. One thing I haven't said much about is Arthur's role as a public intellectual. A very, very important side of his work and persona. He was an advocate for ideas and was constantly kicking Vancouver and challenging it, asking it to do better and build better. And he alienated an awful lot of people. Arthur Erickson did not do a single building in Vancouver between the Vancouver Art Gallery and the Waterfall Building. 20 years of prime time. From age 45 to 65, he had nothing in his own hometown. Why? Because he spoke out and he challenged and asked people to do better. He did it in a very low-key, polite way, not like me, not obnoxious, grating. He was very, very low-key, wearing beautiful suits, etc. But he was pushing. And that's one reason he sponsored me through all of my academic career and writing career, was that he knew that criticism was important, and that without debate about architecture, we're not going to get anywhere. And it's still true.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm also in Marco's class.
Oh, fantastic.
So just to kind of backpack on this idea of criticism being important in architecture, I'm just wondering what your opinions are on criticism of Erickson's work over time, and how like maybe social or economical states have like contributed to this criticism.
Well, I think like many good architects, Arthur believed in it. But when he got it, I gave him some really tough reviews. But he never took it personally. It was always in the realm of ideas. And especially if our arguments were anchored in urbanism, in the logic of construction, et cetera. He had no problem with that at all. He was very, very interested in a public debate in architecture. I'm after teaching at Carleton and here at U of T and Manitoba, I went back to Vancouver and in the mid 90s and really reconnected with Arthur big time, and had a lot of time with him in the last 2 decades of his life, or 3 decades almost. And he was ever more convinced how important this stuff was, that writing, exhibitions, the discourse of architecture was what Canada was missing, and that we needed to do it. And one way he did it was making great buildings like the museums, but the other way he did it was provoking and testing and baiting, et cetera. And he did it with his staff. He drove his staff nuts. They would come, he would be off for a week somewhere, Kuala Lumpur, come back and throw the whole project up in the air and have a redo. And they would scramble to do it, work night and day. Then it would be thrown up in the air again. Ever unsatisfied, quiet, low-key demon for anyone who worked for him. But you talk to people like James Cheng from Vancouver, who I think is a hugely important architect, and others all across the country. They learned from him that you can be principled but difficult. You know, we have to be difficult about our cities. We have to be difficult about third-rate housing. We have to be difficult about transit going in the wrong alignments. So he would take positions on that, very unusual for a Western Canadian architect. So I think that's the lesson to you guys is when in doubt, say it, you know, publish it, do it. Because the lack of risk-taking is part of the reason we're in trouble in this country economically, why we're failing economically. but also why our cities get ever duller. And Toronto, you got to try harder because there's a lot of third-rate developer by the yard buildings here. Arthur saw that coming 25 years ago and wondered why was Toronto going this way. And it has, yeah. Thanks. Was there a question here or was that just a, okay.
Anyone else?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'll just ask the slide that you had us on,
Oh, sorry. Okay.
looking at Robson Square, but then actually going to that drawing, the famous drawing by
Oh.
Erickson.
That's right. I'm gonna
Those two images in mind would be good. What I just regarding the critique, it's hard to project yourself, but you did manage to do a pretty good impersonation a few times in your talk. But I really wonder what Erickson would think about the Herzog and Miron renovation of the Vancouver Art Gallery in these iconic towers. So the Bjarke Ingels thing, which I've heard is actually leaning, I don't know if that's true, but you know, is this there's a difference because there's an organicism, there's a sort of sculpture of form in both of those projects. There's a kind of heroic gesture in relation to the sky in the Bjarke Ingels and the Herzog and Miron Tower that's going to.
Well,
what would Erickson like
a guy
these
called
things, or what do you think?
Kai-Uwe Bergman, who's the right-hand business manager for Bjarke, he knew me, and I was in Seattle a lot, consulting and writing and teaching. So he knew it, and he wanted to have me introduce Bjarke to Arthur. It was a setup, and he tried to have a meeting, but I failed. But what I did do is I engineered a luncheon with Eberhard Zeidler and Bjarke. I booked both of them independently, and they ended up coming in the same day. And I said, "What do I do? Double lunch, whatever?" I said, "Forget it. We'll go for Chinese dim sum, and we'll have a big table and have both of them there." Well, they headed off like crazy, and Zeidler became a key mentor to Bjarke for his Toronto works, like the King Street work and all that. So that was a kind of unexpected convergence. This drawing had not been found when Bjarke started Vancouver House. I discovered it and showed it to Bjarke. Bada bing. There's no question that this kind of organic flowing notion from Erickson is embedded in the Ingels scheme. Vancouver House is a grandchild of this drawing. So for the students in the room, shows you, a drawing you do early in your career could come back and inform your own work or that of others. So I think, again, it was a kind of back and forth dialogue. Arthur, because he didn't use lingo, in architecture schools and academia, we have this notion that if you're really smart, use elaborate, complex language, Latinate phrases, etc. Arthur was a master of the language. He was very, very good speaker, very articulate, but with no apparatus. So he was kind of underestimated as an intellectual. He was a quiet intellectual who was thinking all the time, and his ideas had great impact on others, but without a lot of, the kind of stuff you get from Rem and from other people. So I do think that's very important. How people speak, how they talk about their work, how they draw it, how they show it, are all very important. And I do think it's fascinating when you follow a career from Arthur's. I showed you a couple student projects, early things, right through the end of their life. There are some things that stay the same. Arthur was fascinated with the natural environment and always drew the site, always drew the rocks and the trees, etc. When a lot of his fellow architects ignored that, pretended it wasn't there. So I think it's a really interesting question, and again, was willing to be different. He could have gone to East Coast US, to Boston, and worked for big firms and done quite well. And Toronto people saw his talent and asked if he wanted to go, but he loved Vancouver, loved the landscape. And a lot of his ideas came from travels in BC. He'd been to Haida Gwaii 20 times before he did the museum. So he had a deep knowledge of the traditional post and beam Northwest Coast architecture and was able, from superficial knowledge, to abstract it. And that's the brilliance of Museum of Anthropology, is it takes a tradition, abstracts it, and makes it contemporary. And I think that that's one thing he did very, very well. A good question. Thanks, Dan. Time for one or two more?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Trevor, we've worked you pretty hard, but are you willing to take one more?
Sure.
Anyone willing to ask one more?
No, we don't have to belabor this. Like I say, I'm compiling a collection of my own writing. I started writing as a student because no one told me I couldn't. You know, so I was Alberta's first architecture critic, and then one of the first in Vancouver, because no one else was writing. And you do it, and you grow up in public. You make mistakes, you do things, you revise them, etc. So Arthur always admired that, the kind of autonomy of the creative mind, how you keep going and do it and learn from it and do it again. So I think any of you, the first book on Erickson is really good. The Tundra editions, The Architecture of Arthur Erickson, is brilliant because he did it. He wrote every word, he picked every illustration. This project is in there. There is, you see the marks up there? That's to make the PMT. So they did a photographic shot of this, then they overexposed it and blew it away, and it's in the book. And you don't even know what it was, and there's no credit for it. It's just this organic form in the book. And because they sent it to the printers that got shipped back, that's why they lost it for half a century. So, and anyway, pretty amazing stuff. I'm really glad to see so many of you out on a Monday night. I think you need to know these architects and this and this work. You cannot not know. You know what I mean? There's certain things you need to know as architects. And you know, my friend Michael Sorkin has a long list of 512 things every architect needs to know, like Avogadro's number, et cetera. He goes through it. It's a really good list because you look at the list and you need to know almost all of it. And I think in a lot of ways, the wide embrace of ideas and principles and politics that is architecture is the best thing about this. Thank you for coming tonight.
No.
Now, while we're hanging around, whatever, we'll have the video playing
Okay.
quietly of the, where's the, we'll play that video.
We may have been abandoned. I don't know, where do you have it? Do you have it on your, what was it in? Chrome? Yeah, there you go. So, there it is. Hit, you gotta get down, you gotta get your cursor. While Trevor trying to find his cursor, just to take the opportunity to thank him for this great presentation and thank you all for joining us this evening. Yes, Trevor, you'll just, we had the cartoon intro, now we'll have the cartoon outro. Thanks a lot.
Arthur had a great love-hate relationship with Toronto. And you know, he did some quite weak buildings. The towers down the harborfront, crazy about. Roy Thompson Hall, you look at the massing and the detailing of the piers, it's pretty amazing, but then it's wrapped in the kind of big Thomas skin, et cetera. Even though he had an office here for 20 years, it never quite clicked in the way he wanted to. He had the LA office, which was his due, spent too much money there, hung up with stars, whatever. But we're rediscovering things. For example, he and Francisco's partner did a house in Fire Island, a beautiful house in the 70s, and kind of party down there where that epitome of gay culture. Arthur was the head of the game. Arthur never denied his gayness, but he didn't want it to become how he was. So very interesting guy in that sense as well. And also, same way, he was deeply Canadian, influenced by our landscapes, our history, our books, our art, but didn't wear it on his sleeve, you know? How do we make that a city? How do we do this? I think that's what he was really doing. Okay, so we'll try to get this thing running in a second. House, and they look down on this. So Arthur came up with the notion of the glass blocks, which allows the light in, but blocks direct view. So it's a very ingenious little detail. Where do the curves come from? This is the first question I usually get asked. Why do they curve? He wanted to do something different. He liked the sensuality of the curve, and the notion is like cascades of water coming down from the